Welcome to An Author's Journey, where a prominent author chats with us about their journey as a writer. I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Today's featured guest is Melissa Brady Petrillo, an educator in New Jersey with a passion for promoting empathy and inclusivity in her classroom. Melissa earned her education and English degrees from Caldwell University in 2014, followed by her Master of Arts degree in Educational Leadership in 2018. In college, when Melissa completed a research project about how children's ability levels are portrayed in literature, she implemented her research to write a book from a child's perspective. Her goal is to help students and families understand that everyone encompasses a unique mindset that must be valued in our world today. Most recently, Melissa was recognized as the 2021-2022 Teacher of the Year at her school. In her free time, Melissa enjoys reading, traveling to the beach, and working on extracurricular leadership activities with her students. Melissa, welcome, and thank you for taking an author's journey with us today. We are so honored to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe.
This is going to be a wonderful interview. I can tell already just from the conversations we've had off screen. I'm excited, and your energy I know is going to flow through. So for those folks listening in our audience, you're not going to be able to sit back and relax. Melissa just brings it. She generates the spark, the energy, and she's a good person to listen to. So here we go. I'm going to start right with that first question.
All right.
So tell us, what was your motivation to become a children's book author? I know that you were encouraged from a project, but can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So my grandmother, who, when I was young, she was always a great creative writer. And she always helped my mom when she was a student with creative writing projects. She had such a creative mind. And my family always said to her, "Oh, we wish you could publish a children's book. That would be something great for you to do." Unfortunately, she never got the opportunity. But as a person who always enjoyed literature as well, I always thought I could honor her if I was able to publish a book. And that was a separate thought that I had just through education overall. And then really when I started thinking about it professionally, this class that I took in college, as you mentioned, was about children's and young adult literature. And it was great because in that class, we studied various authors. We were able to conduct literary reviews, and it gave me an opportunity to look at even more books. And then eventually I was able to work on an independent project in my college. And that's when I was just looking on databases one day, and I was writing children's literature, and then I put all this on disabilities. I was like, let's see what comes up. And only one article came up, and it just talked about how there's a lack of books that portray characters with disabilities. And right away from there, I've had a passion to put another book out there and to educate others about this topic and how we need more inclusive libraries.
Now, your book deals with autistic children, correct?
Correct. So my book is narrated by an 8-year-old girl who is on the spectrum, and she talks about her day and the experiences that she has and how she's supported by people within her life. And when I was conducting research, a lot of children's books are told from the third person perspective. So I thought that by having this story told from Samantha's perspective, that's the name of the main character, it would help children to better relate to her.
What do you think was the key to the way you structured the book, not only having it from the first person, but what inspired you, and how did you know when your phrasing of what the character would say was the right phrasing? That was the way you wanted that character to say that.
And you know what, Joe, that's a great question, because that is one of the most difficult parts, I feel like, of writing. You always want to make sure that everything in your text is accurate and it helps children to connect with the topic. So I started working with people of different ability levels when I was in high school. I was about 15. I had a service hour requirement in high school. And I volunteered at the Arc of Essex County, and they have a camp called Camp Hope. So I've been working with people on the spectrum since I was 15. So I feel like that experience helped me, and through years of working with different people, to understand some of the experiences they have had and use it to help write this story. And then also, when I published the book, I originally wrote it in college, and then I didn't publish it until recently. So I had about 6 years or so, and I would try to always refine it. I want to send it to a publisher, and then I'd end up refining the text. So certain things like technology has changed over time, right? And especially what children are using, and some of our phrasing when we're talking about people, and even outside of my own book, when we're talking about inclusive libraries, things like impairments and all different topics that we can discuss. I feel like I am constantly researching on social media, just what is relevant right now and how are people feeling within the autism community. And I wanted to make sure that the book was reflective of what is current.
Did you have someone or someones from the autistic community look at the book to give you feedback, or those who work with the autistic community?
So I did, yeah. A lot of my colleagues, people who I went to college with, and also people who I have worked with throughout the years, I did have them look at it, and they gave me feedback. And then eventually, I have to be honest, I was hesitant to share the story until it was published. And I know that sounds silly, but I was never sure if it was worthy, and I never wanted someone to look at it and think, what are you doing, right? This is not reflective. And since I have published it, I've participated in a lot of different events, like I've presented at the teachers convention, and then I've also, been to some fairs. And a lot of people in the autism community have said to me how they feel like, or parents have said that this helps with inclusion. I've had parents say to me that this helps one sibling understand another who is autistic, or I will hear someone say, oh, I really feel like I relate to this. When I was young, there's no books out like this to help people understand me. And that is truly what it's all about. If we are creating that inclusive mindset, helping people to understand perspective, then the job is really done, right?
I remember meeting you at the New Jersey Education Association Teachers Convention, and I would just stand there. If I had more time, I could have stood there longer, but I would stand there for a few minutes and just watch and see the enthusiasm that you were bringing, and the way you embraced the questions that people were asking, and the empathy that you showed with your responses. Your husband, the same thing, because he was there helping you out. And I said, I have to find out who this is, and I have to bring her on my podcast, because this is somebody who has written not only a book about a topic that I hold dear to my heart, but it's also someone who really gets it, who understands, who knows that you have to be empathetic to a group or a cause or a situation before you can actually think that a book is possible. The author Barbara D is someone I've come to know with the podcast and with doing a book study from her book. And she is a former teacher. And I remember during my interview with her, I said, I know that writing about middle schoolers must be tough, because her main character is a middle schooler. Mm. And I said, how are you sure? How do you check to see if what you're saying is accurate, or how can you stay current? What are your little tricks? And she says, when I go out to schools and I work with classes, I listen. And she said, I think I really understand what a seventh grade mindset is. And I hear what the kids say, and I see how they act and react to each other. And she says, that means the world to me. That defines things. Now, I know you work with a special needs population. And I guess the natural question would be, how much of what your preparation to do that type of work has been, and how much of the coursework, how much of just that feeling inside was there for you to make the decision, I'm going forward with this?
That's a great question, truly. I'm trying to think of exactly how I want to say this. Being a special education teacher and an English teacher has always been a passion of mine. And when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to help people. So I thought, maybe I'd like to be a teacher, maybe I'd like to be a nurse. I went and shadowed a nurse. I said, oh, no way, I can't do this. But I knew as soon as I worked at Camp Hope that that is what I felt I was destined to do. The thing was, all of the work I have done with my students in school prepared me to publish this book, but I always felt more confident in the classroom than I did as an author. And I don't know if maybe I was just more comfortable. That's what I was used to. And all educators know you do so much field work when you are in college. So by the time you start teaching, you're very used to the classroom setting. And I think also, I was advocating for my students always, whether it's in the community, with other teachers in the school building, teaching them to advocate for themselves individually. And I realized really what helped me to understand it, the more research I did on inclusive libraries, and the more I realized the lack of literature, I said, I need to put another book out there for teachers to access, because I can tell other educators and parents all I want. We need to have inclusive libraries. And they can say, great, well, where can I easily find a book that I can share with my class, with my children? And I was concerned at first. I always want to make sure that the book is portraying people accurately. And it's been a great experience for me, because now that I've been through this publishing process, I feel like I can help my students, and I try to help other teachers figure out ways to help the students use their voices to tell their story, because that's the ultimate goal.
Would you maybe share one or two of those little strategies that you share with others?
Yeah, of course, definitely. So some strategies about how to have children write their own stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So something that I say is it's easy for students. I feel like we give students so many prompts about what they're comfortable for, especially for narrative writing. So what's the time you feel like you accomplished something? Or what's a great memory that you have? But something that I've started doing, and as a high school teacher, this is sometimes easier to frame. With the younger population, you have to be more mindful. But I'll say to my students, what's a time where you felt uncomfortable or judged, and how did you react? Or what's a time where you felt like you wish you reacted differently to a problem? Or what's a problem you notice in the world, and what's your experience with this problem? So sometimes giving the students a range of prompts, and even though some of the students will say to me, oh, why are we writing about this? Why would you do this? Because I think it's so easy for us to reflect on the positive experiences, but there's times where we really have to dig deeper to think what we're passionate about and the stories that we wish were told. I always say that to my students, like, what stories do you wish were out there, but you don't see? And then sometimes some other strategies. In my school, we use writer's workshop. So always giving the students the opportunity, like many educators, to brainstorm in different ways. So I'll say to them before they're writing a narrative, okay, let's have a chart, and I'll give them some sentence starters, or I'll give them a timeline. And I'll say, all right, what 3 or 4 events that made an impact on you? And this way, I feel like when we vary choice, we help the students to really think about those experiences that have impacted them. And I always say, eventually, the story doesn't have to be based off of your personal experience. but it can be about a character having a similar one. So this way we put the stories out there for their peers.
As you and I both know, when you use the charts and you use the prompts, you're also addressing the various types of learners. You have those learners who might be a little bit reluctant. You have those who are more visually oriented. The ones who are more verbal, you can sit there and have a discussion with them in your little groups, or they can discuss among themselves. And I know that the Writers Workshop uses a lot of different techniques across the spectrum to get students writing, to get them using the prompts that they're comfortable with and things they know about. Every good writer starts with a foundation of, I know this much, so now let me move forward. If I don't know, I'm going to research, but it has to be mine first before I can tell it to somebody. And
Right.
that's an absolute key. And I know you do that just from, again, the conversations that you and I have had. I can hear that. And the way your students respond is very reassuring. They're fortunate to have someone who understands that writing is a process and that the product doesn't happen unless the process precedes it.
Definitely. And I always say to them, we have to encourage each other while we're writing. You know, it's important that, and as you have mentioned before, we have peer feedback. And that's another thing that I say to teachers when we want students to share their stories. I always say it has to be an inclusive process where everyone gets to assist one another and provide, as you've said before, positive feedback. And this way we help to improve stories, because as you asked me, you definitely have people look over your story before you publish it. There's things you just might not catch, or they might give you a different perspective and you think, wow, that's great. I should have included that from the beginning. So I always try to do that in my classroom as well, because I want to encourage the students to share their story.
Now, we both know as teachers of writing that we hit writer's block once in a while. And there are those weeks where we hit it more often than we'd like to. So do you
For sure.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for students when they run into writer's block? What do you tell them? How do you get them to overcome the block, or at least step around it or over it rather than try to run through it?
Definitely. And I always tell students it's situational, depending on, I said, don't use all these strategies when you're in the middle of a test and you have writer's block. Because one thing I say is like, get up and move. I'm like, don't do that if you're doing a test that's only an hour. But I do think something that I often say is to step away. I think about how many years I stepped away from my book, and then I revisit it every once in a while when I maybe read another good book, or I was just something in my day reminded me of it. So the first thing I would say is to revisit it over time, because I think people put pressure on themselves, and it's not going to be organic if we give strict time limits. Second thing that I say is be inspired. So looking online, right? Listen to what your classmates are saying. Listen to what your family's saying at the dinner table. Any little part of life might inspire you to change your writing or write something about it. So many of the experiences in my book that I have Samantha going through is something I've seen people experience throughout the year, or I've noticed is not present in books at all, but they've all come to me at different times. And then lastly, I would say, really write whatever comes to mind. I think so much we focus, especially online, on organization. And I wrote this by hand the first time. And, you know, if we have a Google Doc in front of us or a Word document, we're worried about, oh, what's the heading at the top and the title? Let's make sure it's all organized. Write in whatever format works for you, a mind map, a web, a chart, anything. And then there's always time to refine before you publish.
Now, did you write much when you were a child? Is this something that's been a vision of yours? And did you enjoy writing in school?
So I will be honest with you. I definitely was not the type when I was a child to always be writing or walking around with a book. I really feel that when I was in high school, I started to appreciate literature. And I think I had amazing teachers in high school that gave me the opportunity to write about what I wanted. And I was a part of the school newspaper in high school. I went to Mount St. Dominic Academy in Caldwell. And I remember the first time I was writing, it was called the Argosy for our newspaper. And I had to write about something, going on within the school. I thought it was great because I had no restrictions. I could write this however I wanted and work with the photographers to include whatever pictures. I felt so much freedom and power in that, and that other people were reading it and said they liked it or it helped them to understand the topic. So really in high school is when I first saw the power of writing. And then it's funny because if people said to me, how would you do with the creative writing class? In college, I would have said to you, no, probably not my speed. I'm more of an analytical writer. But something I've learned is you need that analysis and you need to be looking at analytical pieces in order to do the creative writing. So really when some of us say, I really like informative pieces or I really like literary pieces, they truly do go hand in hand. It's hard to read one without the other, right? So I think that as I saw the power of writing when I was in high school, that transferred with me into college. And now as a teacher, I'm always trying to speak volumes about how important it is for us to write about what we see and experience.
When you were growing up, was it your dream job to be a teacher or to be a writer? Or were you thinking, gee, I wish I could?
Right. And this is something I was thinking about earlier before we were speaking. And when I was in high school, I always wanted to help people. I even liked that when I was younger. I remember being in elementary school and given a job to help a new student, or when you're in upper elementary to work with the younger students. I always enjoyed that, helping people. I just feel like being an empathetic person, that's something that I value. And then as I did move throughout, my middle school and high school years, I was thinking about what occupation I would like. And then I started thinking about, do I want something in the medical field and education? And then when I volunteered at Camp Hope when I was in high school, I knew right away that I wanted to work with children, young adults, and individuals in order to best support them within our community. And it's been great that I can combine these topics of inclusion and literature because it's really two of my passions.
Now, when you write yourself, what's the most difficult part for you?
Most difficult part, I would say, and this is in regards to children's literature because I've received so many questions, which is great. They're like, okay, when's the second book coming out? And I say, you know what? I've only had this released about a year. So I said, well, let me, think about it, receive people's feedback. And it's so flattering for people to ask that. But as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you're doing justice for the text and the theme that you're trying to share with people. But I do find it difficult thinking about the pictures that will go with the story. And I know, Joe, before we started recording, you and I were talking about this in different mediums, because I do think even in my classroom, when we read graphic novels and different informative text, any picture illustration just gives us a different perspective. And I value that so much. If I was to go on and write a chapter book, I would still want to have some images in there as well. So sometimes it's difficult for me. I'm thinking, if I write something on the paper, I stop and think, well, what's that picture going to look like? Oh, well, what's this going to be like? And I was very lucky when I was writing this in college. My husband was an art major. So at the time I showed it to him. He's like, oh, let me sketch some ideas here, which was great for me at the time. But now I think, all right, do I still want to talk about some of the same topics, and will the illustrations be similar? Or can I try to vary the ideas that I have here? So that's one of the most difficult parts. And then the second thing is you want to try to make it to touch upon as many topics as possible. But as a children's author, I don't want it to be overwhelming or confusing, because I think as a young reader myself, that leaves you so frustrated when you read a story and you're like, I don't really get, what was this saying, right? Or like, what was the purpose here? So I want to make sure I'm very clear. And talking about different ability levels is something that's very complex. So when I was writing sometimes originally, I was trying to make all of these ideas, like from social anxiety that Samantha may experience, or how, different sensory ideas. I wanted to make sure it was as clear as possible to the reader. So overall, as I said, the illustrations and making these ideas clear is always my focus.
Now, is there a part of the writing process that you find is the easiest?
What I would say, at first I was going to say, I don't know if there's anything, because it is a complex process. But I do think starting with a character, once you have a character in mind, I feel like the story usually flows, because this character has been something that has been on your mind or has been inspired by so much that you have seen or done. So I do think coming up with a character is always my basis. And then, all right, what's the setting or the settings that this character will be working with? Okay, what are some of the conflicts they experience? And I always use, that idea of that literary structure to make sure that children are able to learn about different things that we should be thinking about in literature.
Now, when you were growing up, did you have favorite authors that you love to read?
That's an excellent question. So I will say, I'm trying to think of what would be best. I feel like I was more inspired as a young adult. And I know I wrote a children's book, but I'm saying as a young adult, just because I appreciated literature more. One of the books that I found so amazing, it's another inclusive text, was Wonder, and how that's written from different points of view. And that author, that book is just amazing. And when we think about all of the different things within that text, you can see not only the inclusive perspective, but the literary perspective and how well that is done. So I would definitely say that, the text of Wonder and how that's organized definitely was an inspiration for me. And R.J. Palacio, I would say, is probably my top author. As a child, I will say I never really gravitated towards one author. And I know that sounds silly, but my brother and I, we would be in a store with my parents, and we would just we'd look at the cover and maybe read the back of the book. My parents would say, okay, great, you can get that. Or really, I was influenced by what I was introduced to in school.
When you were putting your children's book together, was there a point at which you said, okay, I've done enough, it's ready to go? Or are you the type of author that as you are sending it out, you're thinking, oh, wait a minute, I got to check something?
I always was hesitant to send it. I will say that. And as I mentioned earlier, I just want this to be an accurate portrayal of what an autistic child experiences. And, I was always searching and thinking about things I've learned or I've seen or I've heard people say that would most benefit the readers. One thing that I will say that I was always the situation. So in the book, right, Samantha, she introduces herself and she explains who she interacts with throughout the day, along with how she feels comfortable. So she'll say that sometimes if she's overwhelmed, she steps away. Sometimes if she feels like she needs to communicate with other people, she uses technology. So I was always changing the situation to keep it relevant. And I realized at a point that the story has a lot of value. And when I saw there weren't more texts being published, I knew it was my sign that I had to publish it. And I'm so grateful that I did, because as I've said, a lot of people said that they enjoyed it. But you always have that, and as I'm sure you've noticed, I can be a perfectionist. So that's something that I struggled with as an author, putting something in print. Even when I got the first copies of my text, I thought it was beautiful. I was very specific in how I wanted the cover to look, and I was so happy with how it came out. But I was looking at all the sentence structure. I wanted to make sure that everything was clear and to the point. So some advice that I would give writers is your writing is always going to evolve. Just make sure you're taking the risk, because without the risk, you're never going to know the benefit.
A lot of folks would like to publish a children's book and they think, well, it's just for kids, so how tough can it be? That's not the situation at all. Is there any advice you could give those folks because I hear it from kids, I hear it from adults. So, oh, I can do a children's book, and they're so excited. What part of the process do you think they're missing?
I would say that, first of all, I think we're underestimating children at that point. And I always say that as educators, we see how often children and young adults are underestimated. So I think we have to realize that they're always listening. And always, I say their brains are like sponges. They're taking everything in. And we know they'll shock you a couple months later. They'll say, my students will say in my class, remember you told us this story? Like, yeah, you're exactly right. So never underestimate children and the power of literature. And the thing is, literature, we have to be mindful of, we don't want to share something to children that's not well written, because it's always a model. And we want to make sure if the children are taking the time to read a book, that it's teaching them something. And I know a lot of people say literature can also be entertainment, which, yes, 100%. The books are a great world to escape to. But I would want to say that we want to make sure that it's worth the children's time, right? Their time is valuable just like ours, and that they're gaining something out of this book, and it makes them to be a better person. The thing I would also say is never underestimate how complex a children's book is. So you have maybe your characters, you have your storyline, but as I mentioned before, you want to make sure you're using a story arc for people to have something to read towards. And it's not only you have the front cover, the back cover, your own author's biography, right? And then the digital end of it. That's something I did not expect. Look at every page and how is the picture laid out on each page. So I would definitely tell people, encourage everyone, if you feel like you want to write a children's book, do it. But it's a very involved process, and we only want to put strong models out there for our children, because something that I share when I present to other teachers is that, unfortunately, there are books that are not well written, and they're it actually marginalizes characters of different ability levels more, instead of making it inclusive. So I explain to teachers, we really need to have a criteria that we need to go by. And some parts of that criteria are, we need to make sure we're looking at the language that's used. We need to make sure that we're very specific in our language when we're portraying this. We need to make sure that the illustrations are accurate, right? And we need to make sure there's empathy, not sympathy, that we want people to understand the perspective and not say, oh, okay, I feel bad, right? That's not the purpose. So long answer short, it's definitely a little more complex than people might think to publish a children's book.
I thank you for your honesty and the complexity of your answer, because I asked the question since folks don't understand just how complex this process can be. And the enthusiasm sometimes can lead to disappointment if someone minimizes the amount of time or effort or commitment that it takes. And there's a little bit of luck involved too. I mean, all those factors have to come in, and the planets have to line up the right way. It's just one of those things that the folks who make it are far outnumbered by those who don't. But I think what you're also saying behind your words is that go ahead and write your book. Don't write it because you want to be a published author and famous. Write it because it's inside you and you need to put that message out into the general public. Do it as a process. Yeah.
For sure. And you know what? It is, there's some circumstances, like you said. So I had a friend of mine who she published a book about her daughter. And when I told her once, I went to a book event for her and I told her about my story. And she really gave me the idea. Her name is Claire Centrella. She has a wonderful book online, but she said to me, that story needs to be told. And I was like, oh, well, I don't know if it's ready. She's like, you're never going to feel like it's ready, but you have to take the risk. So then when I was reaching out to publishing companies, I actually was told by my current company they'd be happy to publish me. It was right before COVID. It was December 2019. So I was so excited. It was going to take about a year to release. And the end result, it took longer to release just because people were working from home and, people were ill with COVID. And then, factories, as you mentioned, it was more difficult for them to print books. And then I was, there was some frustration because I wanted people to hear this story, but I couldn't host any in-person events. So regardless, and I do think now looking back at it, made me stronger, it made me a little more social media savvy because I had to be, right? Like the only way to get the word out there was using that at the time. But you never know what the circumstances are going to be when you're publishing a text. But you, as you said, you need to have the heart behind it and have the idea that children will benefit from reading this text and the world will be a better place.
And your experience through college, through the workplace, and you're working directly with students has given you that unique background. I mentioned Barbara D before, being a former teacher and understanding the seventh grade mindset. And the book I had mentioned in the book study that I've done, I'll now mention the title because I didn't want to steal any of your thunder before, but the book that we use is My Life in the Fish Tank. And it's about a young seventh grader who is having trouble dealing with the fact that her mom and dad will not let her tell her friends that her brother, who went away to college and crashed his roommate's car, did so because he suffers from a bipolar disorder. And so the family doesn't want to talk about it, and she can't say what's bothering her. And she found that to be somewhat disquieting in that character. And so it's those issues that come up that people deal with. And I think it's wonderful when we take an issue and we demystify it. You're having an autistic featured character narrate the story is a perspective that not only, yes, we're opening up this area of literature now to people who are in diverse situations and who have some challenges in learning and in life, as we all do in our own different ways. And that maybe is a perspective we also need to take. But you're looking at it through a different lens. And so your reader is going to be seeing reality in a bit of a different lens. And I praise you for taking that opportunity to bring that message and put a spotlight on it. Not just a flashlight, but a spotlight. We want this to be seen by everyone. It's not a commercial venture. It's a venture of the heart. The commercial becomes secondary. No one's going to receive millions and millions of dollars for writing a children's book. If that happens, God bless you, more power to you, congratulations. But whatever you get from that, that is not the primary reason for doing it. If it's a benefit, so be it. Wonderful. But thank you for having that commitment and following it through.
Oh, thank you, Joe. And that's so kind of you to say that. One thing that a friend of mine said was that she always was unsure of how to talk about the topic of autism to her children. And then she told me that she read sometime, and then they were out somewhere and they saw an autistic individual. And she turned to her children and said, well, think of Samantha, right? This person is experiencing similar things and feeling the same way Samantha felt. And they were like, oh, okay. To me, that was the best thing that I could hear. That really, she explained to me that Samantha's portrayed in such a positive light, and it's so relatable for children that they're able to relate it to their everyday lives. So that's always the goal, always trying to share that idea with others. And hopefully children will remember that too when they go out into the community.
Thank you for promoting such an idea, and not just promoting the concept of SEL, and not just promoting the concept of breaking down those barriers of prejudice, but also doing something that I think is so important. For the longest time, the word tolerance was used. Mm-hmm. And I just about forbid my students to say that we have tolerance for a certain lifestyle or idea or group, because to me, that's patting someone on the head and saying, they're there, I understand, you're going to be okay. There's no illness here. There's a lack of perspective on the part of the person who's not getting their head patted. The one who's doing the head patting. Yeah.
Definitely. I completely agree. One of the reasons Samantha is a biracial character, she's an Asian American character and a female. And the reason I included that is because when I was conducting my studies, yes, based on research, there's more autistic males than females in our society, but actually a lot of females are undiagnosed just because their behaviors present differently. And most of the children's books that I read before I completed my study that focused on autism focused on male characters. And the characters were either Black or white. So that's why I wanted to include so many different aspects, the female aspect here, the Asian American aspect, and the fact that she is biracial. And I wanted to make sure in her friend group, I try to show that it's very inclusive, right? Because I think when I talk about inclusion in libraries, I'm not just talking about, the autism spectrum and impairments or ADHD. We're also talking about racially inclusive libraries. We want to make sure that our LGBTQ plus community is also being represented. So every choice that we make when we're writing and publishing a children's book, it is going to influence the children when they are reading it. So you want to make sure that you can make it as inclusive as possible.
Melissa Brady Petrillo, thank you so much for taking this author's journey with us today. There are folks listening to this right now, I know, who would like to stand up and applaud your commitment to not just making a difference, but being the difference. It reminds me of the quote by Gandhi, be the change that you'd like to see. And you're doing that. You have a lot of energy. You are committed to making a difference as an educator. And I think your students are extraordinarily blessed and fortunate to have you as their teacher. Your kindness defines your character. And that to me is what is a prerequisite for a great teacher. And you're well on your way to being one of the greats.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. And I always love our conversations. We're always trying to make the classroom a safe space for our students, and it takes continuous work.
It surely does. And having this opportunity to chat with you, I feel that I've been blessed. So I'm going to wish you nothing but success, and know that we'll be chatting about more things in the future, and we'll find ways to connect, because, as I say, your students are very lucky. They have someone who cares. And thank you to all the teachers in all the classrooms who are caring. Yeah. There are so many. The numbers of those who don't care are minuscule at best. And I hope folks can understand that. It is the gross exception rather than the rule.
Especially during these times when we're battling so much with the pandemic, every teacher has put their best foot forward, which is amazing.
Again, thank you so much, Melissa. It is an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, that concludes our journey for this day. Tune in again for more conversations with more authors of interest. For An Author's Journey, I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Have a wonderful day.